San Francisco is the backdrop for a high-stakes summit between the leaders of the world's two biggest economies. U.S. President Joe Biden is hosting talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping, seeking to reduce tensions between the two global rivals. Xi Jinping's four-day trip to the U.S. is his first since 2017 and his first talks with Joe Biden in a year. And there's a lot to discuss with friction to be found over Taiwan, tech sanctions, trade, as well as the conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East. The talks come ahead of this weekend's summit of Asia-Pacific leaders. Here's U.S. President Joe Biden.
Mr. President, we know each other for a long time. We haven't always agreed, which was not a surprise to anyone. But our meetings have always been candid, straightforward, and useful. I value our conversation because I think it's paramount that you and I understand each other clearly, leader to leader, with no misconceptions or miscommunication. We have to ensure that competition does not veer into conflict.
Joining me here at the big table now is DW's Chief International Editor, Richard Walker. Richard, let's talk about the human element here first. I mean, how important is it that these two presidents are sitting down and talking face to face?
Well, it's very important. I mean, I think both sides kind of acknowledge that the relationship with the other is really the most important relationship, the most consequential relationship in the world. These are the two most powerful countries in the world. And this is only the second time in Joe Biden's presidency, roughly 3 years in office, that he's actually had a face-to-face meeting with Xi Jinping. And the last time was almost exactly a year ago, as Joe Biden said in his introductory comments there. And I think kind of what's interesting is that the message you were getting from the Americans a year ago when they met at Bali on the sidelines of the G20 summit, the message they were giving then is almost exactly the same message as they're giving now. Like, we need to kind of give a shape to this relationship where competition is intense, but it doesn't veer into conflict.
It's almost like they're crying wolf, though, in a way, right? The sky's falling all the time.
Well, it's almost like the problems that they were discussing a year ago are exactly the same problems now. And actually, during the course of that year, the situation got even worse. So it shows just how important it is that they really tried to put, as Biden sometimes says, kind of put a floor on the tensions in the relationship.
Yeah. This is the APEC summit. We're talking about trade and economics. But let me put military might front and center for just a moment here. The U.S. and China, militarily, they are not equals, but they are both too powerful to ignore when you're talking about each other. So, I mean, to what extent, then, is this meeting about avoiding military conflicts, risk aversion?
Yeah, from the American point of view, especially, that's very much it. The Chinese are playing a massive game of catch-up in military terms. And they're still not on a level with the US, but they have, in terms of the Navy, for instance, they've actually overtaken the US in terms of the actual sheer number of ships in the Navy, not yet on quite the same level of ships. But what the Americans are concerned about, and I think what many regional powers in Asia are concerned about too, is the risk of accidental conflict between the two sides. And this is because, and particularly in the South China Sea, there are more and more of what are called near misses between American planes, which are patrolling in international skies, and Chinese planes and fighter jets that are getting closer and closer and basically kind of buzzing these American planes with the Chinese message, essentially, get out of our backyard. What are you doing here? And this is happening on the high seas as well. So it's in the air and on the sea. Many near misses. The Americans have said that there were 180 of these near misses in the last 2 years. So these are happening on a very regular basis. Now, the concern is that what happens if two of those planes collide in the air, someone's killed? What happens if a ship collides with another, some people are killed? How do you deal with a situation like that? And because relations are so bad, the Chinese broke off military-to-military communications a year ago, just over a year ago.
They weren't answering the phone, right?
That's right. They haven't been answering the phone. So this is one of the American asks here, is to say, come on, this has to be an absolute minimum. Our militaries must be able to communicate with each other when you come into unexpected situations.
And I mean, these tensions, they seem to be a part of the DNA of this relationship, but we can't forget, both of these countries, they've spent, the past 40 years marrying their economic manufacturing and supply chains, right?
Yeah.
And so what are they doing now in California? Are they talking about divorce?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I mean, some people even coined the term Chimerica to describe just how closely intertwined the two economies became, with China exporting lots of relatively low-cost products into the United States, and also buying a lot of American Treasury bonds in the process. There is now this kind of process or this discussion of either, maybe we can talk about this, either kind of decoupling that relationship, or at the very least is the new parlance de-risking the relationship. But for this meeting to be happening in California, I think it's quite symbolic. The governor of California was very recently in China on a pretty much of a schmoozy kind of tour of China. The big titans like Tesla, Apple, they are highly integrated into the Chinese economy. They have a massive stake in this relationship remaining on an even keel. So yeah, interesting from that point of view too.
I want us to take a listen to what the U.S. president said ahead of these talks. Take a listen.
To get back on a normal course of corresponding, being able to pick up the phone and talk to one another if there's a crisis, being able to make sure our military still have contact with one another. We can't take, as I told you, we're not trying to decouple from China, but what we're trying to do is change the relationship for the better.
So, Richard, another way to say that, we're not trying to decouple from China. Instead, we're trying to de-risk this relationship. Yes. So what's the difference, if there is one?
Well, if you talk to people in China, and I was just recently there, I mean, they see this new term de-risking instead of decoupling. They think that this is just basically the same thing dressed up with a different word. But it does indicate that there has been a bit of movement in the debate within not just the United States, but in Europe as well. This is very much a discussion. Thinking about whether they got, and this is partly informed by the experience of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you know, a country like Germany realizes we were way too dependent on Russian energy. And are we dependent on similar things, whether it's technology, whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's all kinds of things? Are we dependent to an excessive extent on China for those things? The debate in the United States is even further along, and their answer to that is basically yes. And they are trying to kind of onshore battery production for EVs. They're trying to onshore bring back all sorts of manufacturing. And I think from a Chinese point of view, they sort of see this in a direction of going, well, OK, you are trying to decouple by another term. What you hear from experts in the United States and also in Europe is actually, if you look at what China is doing, they're doing their own decoupling too. That there's also an effort to bring like high-tech chip production, stuff like that, back to China to own the IP, the intellectual property behind those things. So you are seeing a bit of a drift apart of these two economic systems.
And where does that leave Europe, especially Germany, an export economy that needs the Chinese market?
Yeah, and certainly, like, Germany is heavily invested in China, especially the car industry, which is, like, in the last 20 years, well, actually, Germany's car industry, its involvement in China goes back decades, way back into the 70s and 80s. And they look at this trend and they're very worried. Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, all those companies make a huge amount of money in China. They manufacture a lot in China, and they are worried about everything from, okay, what happens if there's like a Taiwan invasion scenario? What happens to all those factories? Are they suddenly, you know, cut off just the way that international companies have been cut off from the Russian market after Russia's invasion of Ukraine? But they're also worried about what happens if, so at the moment, for instance, the European Union has launched an investigation into Chinese EVs, whether they are electric vehicles, whether they are unfairly subsidized, whether they are being sold at kind of dumping prices into Europe. German car manufacturers are worried about that because they think, what if China retaliates to that and cuts us out of the Chinese market? So certainly for a country like Germany, a lot of angst around this whole subject.
We've got about 45 seconds left. Drug abuse and drug deaths in the U.S. This is high on the agenda, particularly for President Biden.
That's right. So the Americans are hoping that this is kind of low-hanging fruit that they can get out of this summit. They want the Chinese to crack down on exports of this substance, fentanyl, which is coming through Mexico into the United States and causing pretty serious social problems in the United States. The US hoping to see some movement in China on cracking down on that trade. Richard,
as always, good to have you here at the big table. Excellent analysis. Thank you.